everyone. Back to doing another tier list attempt for Final Fantasy VI. Yesterday I failed to mute the audio. This time around I did, so there is no excuse for me to not do another attempt at a tier list. You'll have to forgive me because I'm a very poor speaker. I will try to do the best I can to be clear and be more instructive as to what I'm going to be saying, among other things. But anyway, this is just basically my own version of Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster tier list for playable characters. We're going to be going over which characters I think are the best and which I don't think are the best. Well, technically just about every character, in my opinion, is definitely the best, but it is not impossible to ignore flaws in some of their gameplay features. But overall, every character, in my opinion, is going to be very great. But if people wanted to know what I think about characters in Final Fantasy VI, I definitely want to do my own tier list. So this is another reason why I'm doing it. So before we get started, there's 3 disclaimers I want to put out real quick. First and foremost, this is personally my opinion. Just because I think certain characters are good and certain characters are bad, that doesn't mean everyone enjoys playing those characters that are bad and consider the best characters the worst. So this is just basically my opinion, who I think is arguably the best or worst in Final Fantasy VI in terms of playable cast in general. But you're free to disagree or agree, whichever way you want. Number 2, the tier list is going to be graded on S through A, through B, and through C. S being the best characters in the game, C being the worst characters in the game, A being the second best characters in the game, B being usually around the average to near low end of the cast. So basically, this tier list is going to be the third and final one. Is pretty much, it's going to be based on availability. Their rankings are going to be based on availability when they join up in both World of Balance and World of Ruin. Second is going to be their equipment options. Technically, anyone with stat boosting gear is going to have a lot more interesting say-so than those that can't in general. Second, of course, is and finally, stats are also taken into consideration as well. Sometimes some characters can do pretty darn well with poor stats, but others can have great stats but don't have very good skills. But there's a lot of criteria that goes into in my choosing as to who I think is going to be very, very functional. And just about every character does very well in certain areas of the game. It's just that not all of them are going to do very well. And it also comes down to equipment and stats, because you're either focusing on physical attack or magic attack. And of course, in Final Fantasy VI, magic is king. So therefore, anyone that can do magic is going to be doing a lot more better than most members. But then again, some characters that do physical damage can do pretty darn well as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So just as a quick reminder, characters in the S tier will go right here. This is the indicator for Party 1 slot. Party slot number 2 is going to be reserved for the A tier. Those are characters that are going to be generally useful throughout the entire game. Tier B, which is the third party member slot, this is going to be for those that are pretty much average and have situational skills in general, or have somewhat decent stats but not really that good in the main scope of things. And then C, of course, definitely has characters that have very situational skills or abilities, or have pretty low stats or anything else in general I don't really think would be very good in a playthrough. But technically, even those characters that are in the C tier are not bad in general. It's just really player's preference. And just because I have some of those characters in C tier, that doesn't mean that I consider them bad. But it's really up to the player to decide which they think is going to be useful and in terms of gameplay, stats, and everything else. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So Terra is our first character we're going to cover. She's the first party member that we get immediately in World of Balance when we start the game. She will join up after we get the Falcon back and complete 2 parts in Moblis and defeat Humbaba for good. Terra is basically a phenomenal offensive tank, both physically and magically, once she gets access to trance. So in my opinion, she's going to be in the A tier. This is basically due to the fact that Terra gets access to Force Shield and Force Armor. This combined with some other stuff can really boost up her magic evasion and defense to max for the most part, or very high levels. So she can easily do a lot of magic tanking in World of Ruin. Her Esper form with Trance allows her to get more strength, as well as amp up her already powerful magic in the entire game. Not to mention she has the second highest magic stat in the entire game. Even though her strength of 31's on the low end, it could still be serviceable. And if you get some of the better weapons like Ultima Weapon, Ragnarok, or Lightbringer, she'll be a force to be reckoned with, even with Excalibur or Zakutskin. Those can still serve her very well. Not to mention she gets access to Manivir Bustier, which will allow her to either negate some of the elements or have the damage off of them. So that actually makes Terra actually a pretty effective warrior in the late game of World of Ruin, and in my opinion, she's actually one of the more better fighters once Trance becomes available. So for the most part, as long as you build up her strength and magic, her Trance is going to be very useful, but I would strongly recommend Trance being used only for boss fights, because those are the more important battles that Terra needs to be focusing on most of the time. So Locke is our second playable party member. He's more of our go-to supporter, thanks to his stealing abilities, and we're going to put him on the B tier. Locke is actually a pretty decent physical attacker, even though characters like Science, Shadow, and Edgar can pretty much outclass him, but he's still a very decent physical fighter overall, especially if you do decide to get Jinjai gloves early through refusing to accept Banon's offer to join the returners. Overall, with proper knowledge of what you can take from enemies, Locke can steal very valuable weapons, armor, relics, items, etc. He's just very good in most situations, but throughout World of Balance, but he does kind of drop off in World of Ruin, since he's more likely to be the last character that rejoins, due to the fact that you need 8 party members to take on the Phoenix Cave and make it through that unscathed to get to the end where Locke is. But once he does return with the Phoenix Esper in tow, along with the Valiant Knife, he does pick up a lot of usability in terms of that weapon as well as Ultimate Weapon. He does get access to throwing weapons, which can put him in the back row. Wing Edge, which is one of his more better weapons, thanks to stat gains, will enable him to basically allow him to gain some additional stats, especially with Jinjai Glove armed. He can definitely get way more stats on physical attacking than the others. I mean, he just does pretty darn well in supporting and fighting, but against other spellcasters as well as skilled fighters, he definitely struggles against competing with those characters. In my personal opinion, Cyan is definitely one of my favorite characters, along with Sabin and just about some of the more notable casts in Final Fantasy VI. But even that is not enough to ignore some of the more obvious signs of him being not very good in terms of gameplay, and I'm forced to agree with those that pretty much think Cyan is one of the worst characters in terms of gameplay, not story-wise, so therefore I'm going to put Cyan at C tier, but in my opinion, he's at the top of C tier. And that's because Bushidos are actually pretty darn useful. The real problem is though, even though Cyan is going to be more geared towards strength, Bushido in general actually combines physical and magic-based combat. So you really do need to build up Cyan's magic stat, even though it's a very terrible level of 25, and his agility is at 28. Those can be easily remedied with Esper leveling up bonuses. So that can actually remedize some of Cyan's more worser problems. He has more chances of getting that out of his system more or less than Gogo does, who has magic stat at 26. But technically, his Bushidos have three attacks that deal strength damage, being Fang, Flurry, and Tempest. Of course, Tempest being OP once Quick spell becomes available for Cyan. And of course, he's got magic-based Bushidos, namely Sky, Dragon, and Eclipse. Eclipse being his only true multi-targeting mob attacking skill, which is pretty nice to have. not to mention inflict stop. But technically, once Cyan gets access to Quick, he becomes a lot more of a beast. But unfortunately, he doesn't have a whole lot of equipment that boosts up stats. Earlier on in World of Balance, he does get access to Twisted Headband and Power Stash, and even Marsame for evasion boost. In World of Ruin, he doesn't get a whole lot of katanas outside of acquiring them from beating bosses or whatever. Ironically, his best katana is actually giving him 20 plus evasion, so he does have pretty decent evasion, but overall, when you're going up against party members with better magic stats than Cyan, he does struggle quite a bit. But in my opinion, I don't consider Cyan one of the worst characters in the entire game in general. Not to mention when you give him either circular red cap or Jinjai armor, he will do pretty decently as a physical fighter. And even do a little bit more so as a magic, get some spell casting in once it's up to a certain amount. Of course, he'll never outpace Relm and Terra and Celes and the others in magic damage, but still, it's a good idea to get his magic stat out of the 25 range and get it to more serviceable levels to make it a little bit more reliable and useful. So, Shadow spends pretty much almost the entire game, or I should say the World of Balance, unavailable due to his come-and-go nature, but he's definitely well worth keeping if you want to have him for World of Ruin. And that definitely, in my opinion, puts him at A tier. But I would consider him at the bottom of A tier because of his finicky availability in World of Balance. Stat-wise, Shadow is pretty strong and fast. And his magic and stamina are actually pretty decent. He actually falls into the well-balanced stats like Terra and Celes do. Not to mention, throw is utterly busted since it ignores defense. He can virtually get access to every elemental weakness type in the entire game if you have the certain weapons in the inventory. Not to mention with Gravity Rod, he can get access to Earth, and that makes it a lot more safer Earth attack option than using Quake spells or even going for Magnitude 8 in general with Gauss Rages. He also gets access to elemental scrolls for Aga damage. He can also equip Thief Knife, and that makes him somewhat of a thief in general, since he gets the ability to do Mug as well. With that, in turn, Shadow can also protect himself from all statuses with a combination of Memento Ring and Ribbon outside Doom. So overall, Shadow is generally a very good character once you get him, and once he joins you in the World of Ruin for the rest of the game, up until the game's ending, he's going to be very serviceable to the player, and I would strongly recommend using him outside of fighting enemies that have the Rippler bug, so be sure to take those enemies out, or otherwise you will lose the Interceptor, which is considered a status to him. Edgar is considerably the jack-of-all-trades character, in my opinion. Tools are just very busted earlier on, though they do fall off quite a bit in World of Ruin, but in my opinion, I would consider him on the A tier in general. Edgar can equip some of the best weapons in the entire game, like Ultimate Weapon, Lightbringer, and Ragnarok. He can also equip Spears, which also makes him an ideal choice for Dragoon training. Not to mention if you give him access to Radiant Lance or Holy Lance, which makes him a very effective fighter in general. And of course, but his equipment options are pretty terrible. World of Ruin, he definitely gets more benefits of wearing either the Red Jacket or Jinjai armor in general. Circlet will do very well in boosting up his other stats, but Regal Crown is also a notable exception in terms of stat boosting. Edgar is just pretty darn powerful when it comes to using the drill. If Chainsaw wasn't an instant death attack, that would make Edgar effectively more stronger in general. But even with the instant death attack, it does instant kill undead enemies, and that prevents them from being revived. And it's even considered a magic attack as well. Of course, his magic stat is pretty low, but that can be easily remedied thanks to his early join time in both World of Ruin and World of Balance. Not to mention he's also one of the 3 important characters you need to recruit in World of Ruin to beat the game in general. He's just very useful from start to finish, as well as his twin brother Sabin, who we cover next. In my opinion, he's almost close to being a one-man army almost. And in general, he's very useful throughout the entire game. And just like his twin brother, I would put Sabin at the A tier. But in my opinion, he would be at the top of A tier. And that's just how broken blitzes are in general, because they ignore defense, ignore split damage, and they're all unblockable. Of course, his healing blitzes are not too great, even though to my discovery of Soul Spiraler being virtually excellent to combat multiple status elements in the entire game, but in general, Sabin's more of an offensive fighter rather than a healer. Of course, his accessibility to Aura Cannon, Rising Phoenix for World of Balance, and then later on with Razor Gale and Fan Rush for World of Ruin are going to make Sabin a very useful fighter. He's going to do either heavy damage or wipe out enemy mobs pretty quickly, especially if you focus mostly on his magic stat, though it's not a bad idea to keep his second highest strength rating up to date as well, because he can do pretty hefty damage with regular attacks and even do even more so with Raging Fist and Meteor Strike. But for the most part, you definitely want to prioritize Sabin being a magic damage dealer. And thanks to his endgame equipment, even though it's not exactly the best, he will get a ton of stat bonuses to most of his stats. So by the time he gets access to Tiger Fangs, Red Jacket, Circlet, he's going to have pretty high magic, pretty high strength in general. Of course, expert players will probably not enjoy playing Sabin as much, since blitzes are not going to be something they'll want to utilize, especially since a good chunk of characters can take advantage of other features like good armor, like Force Shield and Force Armor, or Dragoon setups, etc. There's other means to deal more damage, but in general, Sabin is just very useful thanks to his early join times in both World of Balance and World of Ruin, not to mention he's our only optional character earlier on in World of Ruin, and that really makes him a definitely must-have character in most teams. And makes him a go-to boss killer once Fan Rush is acquired. Give me a few seconds to let me down some water. Anyway, we're now covering Celes. When you compare Celeste's stats against Terra's, she's actually a lot more stronger than Terra. But unfortunately, due to Runic, she will not be as offensively powerful as Terra, but she still remains one of the better mages in the entire game in general, so I'm going to put Celes in the B rank. Runic is more of a double-edged sword because even though that can be used to stop certain bosses' strategies with magic, it also acts as a double-edged sword against your own playable characters, especially if you're trying to cast spells to heal or support your team. Strago, on the other hand, can bypass that thanks to his lures, but unfortunately, Runic is just not very reliable in most situations. But she does do quite a bit of damage with her spells when she gets access to them. She also gets some pretty noble weapons like Ultima Weapon, Ragnarok, and Lightbringer, as well as the usual Sakutskin and Excalibur. So, and even in enhancers, especially with Terra equipping one of those or two of them with Jinja Glove, you can definitely boost that up along with any female exclusive gear like Nivea or Bustier, which improves MP, magic more MP for Terra and Celes, as well as give her additional elemental defenses and negations, which makes her very good for dealing with a large amount of spellcasters, and in turn she can deal very high damage with spells. But overall, she'll do pretty well in both categories of strength and magic, but spellcasting is going to be way more better since Terra is going to be more offensively with both physical attacks and magical attacks with trance applied, and Locke's actually considered to be more stronger than Celes in terms of starting strength stat of 37 in general. But overall, Celes is just very usable, and it just really takes quite a bit of work to utilize Runic to play in your favor. But overall, she's going to be a very good mage, and I would strongly recommend prioritizing making her in that role as such. Strago, on the other hand, has very late join time. He and Relm are pretty much cursed to have very late join times in World of Balance. They might be, depending on how fast you get him and Relm back on your team in World of Ruin, he might be one of the last few characters you do get back, but he does you will have plenty of time to train both him and Relm in World of Ruin, but as a character, I would consider Strago to be at the B tier, at the low end of the B tier. in this case, and that's because Strago's lures are tied to his MP as well as his magic as well. He does have a magic stat of 34, which ties him with Gao, but Gao gets more hang time than Strago does. And unfortunately, Strago does have very poor stats due to his age and everything. Of course, he and Gogo tie for the worst strength stat in the entire game. Probably has the worst stamina in the entire game with 19. He does have poor agility of 20 or so, and it just really hurts Strago in overall in terms of other stats outside magic. I mean, you would think Strago would do incredibly well in Final Fantasy VI with magic being the main focus. But he just really struggles against Relm, Terra, Celes, heck, even Gao, Mog, and Amaro can outpace him in terms of starting magic stats. But it's not to say his lures are bad. Most of his lures are actually more offensive based than most Final Fantasy games that do feature blue magic. Of course, obvious examples being Aqua Breath, Tsunami, Arrow, Quasar, Grand Delta. Of course, level 4 Flare is very powerful in this game, and if you can keep your gil on specific digits, you can definitely hit every enemy with level question mark Holy. So, and of course, Mighty Guard and White Wind for the win. Those are actually his best supporting spells in the entire game, and you should definitely try to get those whenever you get Strago. But Strago just faces very heavy competition. If it wasn't for Mighty Guard and White Wind in general, he would definitely be put on the C tier, and that's because he needs to be really protected against status elements if you're trying to learn all of Strago's lores. Not to mention, Fiend is the only boss in the entire game that only teaches Force Field, and even though Dark Force has virtually every lore outside Force Field, getting him to have Quasar used is kind of tricky, so you might need 2 separate trips to go to get both Force Field and Quasar for Strago, because Goddess is more likely to use Quasar than Dark Force does. Ah, welcome, CG. Unless you are the real CG, by the way. Just to clarify. Sorry about what happened to you, by the way. Anyway, I need to keep focusing on my tier list for right now. Okay, good. So anyway, moving on to the tier list. Now, this is going to be a very controversial pick right here. Yeah, I know. But yeah, like I said, this is going to be a controversial pick for Relm because I agree with everyone. She's actually the best mage in the entire game. But I did run into some problems with her skills, namely with Brachiosaur and Tyrannosaurus. They literally made sure that players can't really abuse control and sketch on those monsters. And it's because of that and some issues with those abilities, I would consider Relm to be at the B tier. But in my opinion, she would be at the top of B tier. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that is sad. Yeah, I mean, hopefully those guys in Discord can probably help you. Hopefully. Well, anyway, continuing on with the character overview, Relm is arguably a very good mage despite her late join up. She does start off at a magic stat of 44. She does have like the second worst physical strength of 28, but she does have decent agility, and her stamina is kind of like the second lowest. And for the most part, Relm is actually pretty decent. Both her and Strago get access to the Behemoth suit, which will actually give them +6 on all their stats. Of course, with Cat Earhood, she'll even get a little bit more stat increases as well as reduced elemental damage. And with Magus Rod, she'll get another +7 on her magic stat. Of course, that's only if you're planning to get Magus Rods from raising your heal rods and trying to take on the nefarious Tomberries. But technically, it's going to be a toss-up between which character you want to apply the Magus Rod to. But overall, Relm's still going to be a very good mage. I mean, her sketch and control are still going to be very useful, even though they're not going to be nearly as useful with Brachiosaur and Tyrannosaurus. One thing to keep in mind with those abilities, you do need to have Relm's level either equal or higher than the target she's going to go for the most part, and she can definitely help Strago learn some good lores as well. But I just find her, even with her ability to be a very good mage, kind of puts her at odds with some of the more characters with uh, noble skills that are actually more offensive based in general. But still, Relm's going to be very useful, and with control, she'd be a good partner for Locke, because Locke can steal any enemies from those controlled enemies without retribution. And overall, she's actually a pretty good character, but the characters I listed for A are probably going to be way more stronger than her in certain areas. But overall, when it comes to magic, no one beats Relm. Now, Setzer will probably be a bit questionable in general. Some might put him on B tier or lower, but I'm not a big fan of Chance in general with his slots and whatnot, so I'm going to put him in the C tier, and I would consider him to be at the bottom of C tier. And that's because Cyan's actually more better than Setzer, in my opinion. And even having access to fixed dice plus Master Scroll combo, unfortunately, does not prevent him from being unexcused for having some issues. Because unfortunately, with fixed dice Master Scroll combo, it means his magic and strength stats become rather obsolete, because none of them get calculated with fixed dice damage. Even though it does make Setzer a very powerful fighter, it really depends on the rolls that he gets. So if he gets low rolls, he will not hit very high in general. But there's other characters that can do it more consistently better than him. His endgame weapon options are pretty terrible, because Death Tarot and Viper Darts both inflict either instant dispatch or instant death attacks. And unfortunately, in World of Ruin, a large amount of enemies tend to be either undead or immune against instant death. And I'm not a big fan of slots, because Prismatic Flash and Chocobo Bop or Missing Rabbit are going to be the more common rolls you'll see. And it's very hard to get Die Bomb to be triggered, not to mention wasting 2 different reels for summons that we would normally get on with Espers is kind of rather pointless in general. And of course, trying to take advantage of Joker's death is not very fun, especially if you get the version 1 and not version 2. If it wasn't for those issues, Setzer would be placed way higher. But in my opinion, Chance is just not a very strong element, in my opinion, in this game. And technically, there's other characters in this game that could do a way better job than Setzer does. But he's definitely one of the more better candidates for the Master Scroll, in my opinion. It's just, there's other party members that could do way better than him. But technically, if you want to prioritize slots, just prioritize building up his magic. He does have very high strength, but that might apply for Guild Toss, but you might have to wait until later in the game when his levels are way higher and you got a ton of Guild to make full use of it. Let me take a quick swig of water before we continue. Alright, back. So anyway, Mog is pretty interesting. He does have a rather late join time, like Strago and Relm do in World of Balance, and that's because he won't join up by the time you get into after you get done with the Imperial Lands and recruit him instead of getting the gold hairpin from Lone Wolf. As a playable character, he's actually pretty decent, even though his equipment options for stat boosting are pretty limited at best. But given the fact he's one of the 2 party members, aside from Omaro, that can equip the Snow Scarf, he's actually a very good physical tank in general, when you take that into account. So I would consider Mog to be in the B tier. Dances in World of Balance are actually pretty decent overall, especially when you take into consideration of some pretty good ones like Wind Respiratory, Earth Blues, and some other notable ones like Water Harmony, which is exclusive to World of Balance. But dances do kind of fall off by the time you get into World of Ruin, but they're still serviceable. But unfortunately, another problem I consider with Mog is that his armor options, especially body ones, become rather limited in World of Ruin, because he's mostly tied to heavy armor. His best armor up until Snow Scarf becomes available is Diamond Vest, which is not very good. He doesn't have very huge amount of options for stat boosting gear. Twisted headbands, circlet, and red cap are notable because those are his only stat boosting options. Of course, if you give him Jinjai Shield or Elemental Shields, he'll do pretty darn well as well. Not to mention, he's going to be a very good Dragoon in general, so he does very well in that. Not to mention with Magalulu's Charm, which eliminates enemy encounters, so it's rather pointless given the fact that with the Pixel Remaster, you can easily toggle whether or not you want to deal with encounters or not. So overall, he's a pretty average, if not very good character. He will have very good strength if you invest heavily into that for Dragoon setups, and if you do dances, he will do pretty nicely with a very good magic stat. So overall, he's very good on both physical and magical attack options, but his dances are going to be problematic since, one, you won't have control of him, and you don't have any choice as to which one he'll do for attacks. So, if I was to tell you right now that Square Enix was kind enough to tell you that Gao is the most powerful, playable character you get early in the game, most people would just laugh at me and whatnot. But those that do understand the mechanics for the rage system and discover the ins and outs will quickly discover Gao is actually one of the most powerful party members, despite not being very reliable in the story. So in my opinion, I consider Gao to be at the top of S tier. And that's because with rages, Gao gains status immunities, the ability to either absorb or negate elements and have elemental damage. He also gains some pretty wicked attacks from certain monsters like Behemoth's Meteor. He can also get access to pretty early water and wind rages depending on enemies. He can also get access to all elemental abilities through rages way before the party does get access to them through Esper training in general. And he can also get some powerful abilities like Io's Flare Star and Yujimbo's Shock. Even though a lot of the enemies will reuse some of the attacks in World of Ruin, there's a good chunk of them that Gao can make full use of. Not to mention, some of those rages can also allow Gao to help Strago learn lores. In general, he's just very useful in general. I mean, he doesn't get a whole lot of weapon options, and he's actually one of the other two party members that can make full use of the Snow Scarf, so that makes him also good for tanking, especially if you give either one of them the Jinjai Helm along with Snow Scarf. He will be able to take hits and not have to worry much for damage. Of course, you do have to worry about his magical defense, but he does have like the second best evasion outside Shadow, so he's actually pretty darn good overall. And it's best players do take the time to train Gao rages because any rage can help turn the tables and tide in your favor. He's just definitely one of the more harder characters to get into, but once you do get used to the rages and everything, not being able to control him becomes a mere afterthought. And you definitely reap the benefits and rewards from it as well. So Gogo is our versatile mage, pretty much, and he's actually on the S tier along with Gao, despite having very poor stats and limited equip options. In my opinion, Gogo is very, very powerful, despite not having Esper level up bonuses and the whatnot. His ability to either mimic previous party members' action, as well as the ability to utilize every skill in the entire game outside Terra's Trance and Umaro's exclusive attacks. Gogo can do some pretty phenomenal damage in his own right, and players should not underestimate just how powerful this mimic is. I mean, this mime is in general. He's just that darn good, and focusing him on magic is definitely going to be the big key. Giving him Magus Rod, Circlet, and Magus Robe will be very good for him in the long haul. He can equip. He can also be your go-to thief. He can do whatever the party wants him to be, or in the player's case, what they want him to be. So even without stat boosting and everything, Gogo is just going to be fantastic to help any team, and he can also fill in any holes that any of the players' party might need coverage. So this also leads to our final party member, Romaro. So technically, most people consider Umaro to be the worst party member in Final Fantasy VI, and that's because he cannot be controlled. But when I was doing research on Umaro, it turns out Umaro is not terrible as most people believe him. Most people believe. He's actually extremely well-rounded, having good stats on everywhere, not to mention his starting magic stats 37. So this actually makes him the third highest magic user, despite not having accessibility magic in the entire game, which is laughable in general, because he outdoes Celes, and she has 36 for a starting magic stat. But I am forced to agree that he definitely belongs in the C tier, but I do not consider Umaro to be the worst character in the entire game. That belongs to Zetsu. And that's because even though Umaro is uncontrollable, if you do give him access to Berserker Ring and Blizzard Orb, he can be very efficient when the chips are down. He will, especially Ally Toss, Slam being his more high damaging attacks, and if you're willing to give him a Gauntlet, he does pretty high damage with that applied. So despite not being able to equip anything, Umaro's Snow Scarf allows him to tank hits, and with either Berserker Ring and Blizzard Orb, it does give him the ability to absorb certain elements and negate certain elements. Berserker Ring allows him to absorb fire, and it does give him the ability to negate wind damage, even though the game doesn't describe it as much, because I have seen enemies try to blast him with Sandstorm, and he took no damage. So he can actually nullify wind as well. But overall, even though Umaro doesn't really thrive against certain boss fights like Chatternook and any boss that requires a specific strategy, Umaro can basically thrive in other areas where physical fighting is going to be the most heavy to go-to business. Like, he definitely thrives on Ancient Castle, because all the enemies have very high magic defenses. He can basically, he's basically the exception of the Cultist Tower's rule of only magic is your only offense. Because he'll do attacking even though those monsters will have very high physical defenses. Of course, unless you do decide to give him Snowstorm, which will also pretty much serve him decently well if you're going up against enemies that are weak against ice. But of course, his uncontrollable nature prevents him from being really more useful. But in terms of being a more well-rounded character, I would strongly say he's not terrible for the most part. So anyway, that's my take on this tier list. Of course, you're free to disagree, and you're also free to agree what I've said about the characters. Heck, if you don't think any of the characters on C tier should be higher than what they are, I mean, you're free to disagree on that. Or heck, do with any of the other characters. But that's just my 2 cents on it, and this is based on my personal experience from playing these characters in Final Fantasy VI. Of course, that doesn't diminish my love for playing any of these characters. This being my first Final Fantasy game, I really got myself into. I have very fond memories of it in general, and that's not going to change anytime one bit. And that can be said for anyone that got into the Final Fantasy series, whether it be the first game, the second, the third, etc. Whatever entry you got into, it's always going to be the first game you played in the series, and is always going to be the one that everyone enjoys best. And for me, Final Fantasy VI is probably my personal favorite in general. So anyway, that concludes my tier list. We do have 8 more minutes before we call it in for the stream. I do have dinner coming up within 35 minutes. Plus, I do want to highlight my 1108 on Merc's Genesis, as well as get and highlight this tier list to export to YouTube eventually. I do have early bedtime tonight, so I cannot stay up. But anyway, thank you, CG, for stopping by, and thank you, everyone, for hanging around for this tier list. We are going to play a little bit of the new playthrough of Final Fantasy VI before we call it in for the day. And I'll come back in I shouldn't say come back in a minute. We'll get started in a minute, but I'm RotorStorm331 signing off. I mean, not signing off, but making an end to this tier list. My apologies for screwing up a lot of things I'm saying, but anyway, this is RotorStorm331 signing off on this tier list. We're still doing streaming, so wait a few seconds. I'm going to get me some water, and then we're going to be getting ready to play some Final Fantasy VI on my new playthrough that I just got started. So.